Well, it is finally time to place all 4 of Fallout 4's main factions up against each other and see who truly comes out on top. Will it be the Brotherhood of Steel through their brute force tactics? I'm sure you get my point. Will it be the Institute with their incredibly secretive base and their embedded soldiers?
Goodbye, McDonough.
You'll never take me alive.
Is it going to be the Minutemen with their overwhelming amount of numbers? Or maybe, just maybe, it will be the Railroad. No, it won't. Well, without further ado, let's jump straight into this and see what faction would truly be the last standing in the Commonwealth if they all fought to the death. Before I continue with this video, I would ask that you like the video if you enjoy it, and I would ask that you subscribe to the channel so you can see more content like this, and let me know down in the comments what content you want to see going forward with the channel. Hit the bell too, and thank you guys ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Now, before we properly start this video, let me just set some ground rules. I had quite a hard time deciding how I was going to do this video, but in the end I decided that all factions will start off at their bases and their main job will be to take over the city of Boston in the Commonwealth. The main point of interest all of the factions will want to take will be the mass fusion building, much like the BOS and the Institute fought over in that mission. Now, this video will be taking into account all the equipment and figures I found in the previous videos. Now, this video is going to be told in kind of a fan fiction-y way, so if you don't like that, then I'm sorry, but this is how I think the events will unfold. But if you don't like that kind of narrative storytelling element of the video, don't worry, because I'll still be going through each section, analyzing and talking about each different event that's happening to do with each faction and telling you why I think this event is happening. So the video will basically be half me telling you a story and then half me telling you why I think that would happen in the story with the evidence I have gathered. Oh, also just remember that this video is based on all factions if they were at their peak in strength. So what I mean by this is I'm basically setting every faction to max power. I might do some sort of separate video for factions that I didn't think would win this overall battle but might win battles like defending their base from certain factions or all factions. So without further ado, let's get into this thing. The first thing we need to discuss is obviously mobility, and what I mean by that is how quickly each faction will be able to gear up, move out and get ready to fight. The first faction I want to talk about is the Institute, because I feel like they would mobilize their forces the quickest for quite obvious reasons. The Institute would take around 355 synth units straight into battle, leaving around 50 synths to hold the Institute base. The Institute would be able to instantly teleport troops to whatever key positions they thought would make a good defendable location within central Boston. The Institute would most likely use mostly their Gen 1s and Gen 2s as manpower to take mass fusion, so I think there would be around 125 Gen 1s actually inside the mass fusion building, and then around 70 Gen 2s in the mass fusion building. The backbone of the defense of the mass fusion building would be, of course, the Gen 3 synth courses, in which I think there would be about 15 of them. And if we're valuing the Institute at their best, let's throw in Kellogg as head of defense of the Institute. I think the Institute would place the rest of their forces mainly positioned around the mass fusion building, taking up defensive positions. The Institute have about 145 troops to place about, so I think they would do this by placing the rest of Gen 1s and Gen 2s together in small squads around the mass fusion building. They would definitely have Gen 3s as well, courses around the mass fusion building, but I also think they would embed them into where they thought enemy lines would appear, and also have them in key faction locations such as Diamond City. 145 troops would be placed around the outside of mass fusion, but they would also be placed in tall buildings and places all around the center of Boston that they could could deem as a good place to hold against oncoming attackers. I also think a small group, maybe 20 synths made up of Gen 3s and 2s, would be sent to try and quickly wipe out the railroad, so the Institute could try and stomp them out before they actually got into the real fight. That way the Institute would be able to concentrate their fire on the Brotherhood and fighting them. Now let's move on to the BOS. The Brotherhood of Steel would quickly mobilize their troops from the Pridwin. I think around 6 vertibirds plus the one from Cambridge Police Station would be launched straight away. That's 30 troops being sent straight to the mass fusion building straight away. That also means 5 or 12 Brotherhood Knights, which depends on what you think each vertibird is carrying in terms of Brotherhood Knights. The minute their first wave of vertibirds would have left, the Brotherhood of Steel's Pridwin would prep more vertibirds to be launched instantly. Proctor Ingram and Paladin Dance would lead this charge from the air, while the rest of the BOS march on foot, getting Liberty Prime ready to march with them to mass fusion. For now, Elder Maxim would remain on the Pridwin. I think around 690 of the BOS's 840 men would be instantly mobilized, as 150 troops estimated would stay at the Pridwin to guard Elder Maxim. This would include, of course, scientists and also pilots. The BOS would only reinforce Cambridge Police Station, leaving Knight Reeves in charge of the place to make it battle ready, and to make it as a staging ground / camp to move troops and treat wounded. Other than that, the BOS would fly straight into Boston and try to take down the Institute from the air, whilst their ground troops march into Boston to enclose on the mass fusion building, trying to use their brute force tactics and overwhelming numbers and troops to take down the Institute quickly. The railroad would be instantly thrown into action, as the Institute would launch their surprise attack on the railroad's main headquarters. Okay, now let's get a few things clear. The railroad is very weak, and I mean really weak. So just for the sake of this video, I'm going to give him a couple extra men. By a couple I mean like, let's chuck in 100. I don't think it'll make much difference. The railroad would have to leave around 30 troops at their base to hold their main base. They would also have to leave around half their agents at their base to defend it, so I'm going to say 14 agents at their base. Let's just say there were 60 railroad soldiers for the sake of this video, so the other 30 railroad soldiers and the other 14 agents will move out with Desdemona and Deacon. They will take the secret exit outside the railroad base to try and get to Bunker Hill. Upon arriving at Bunker Hill, around 10 troops would be left there to secure the base. Around 5 of the 14 railroad agents would also be left at Bunker Hill to defend the base. Then 10 men as well as 5 railroad agents would be sent to defend Goodneighbor. They would defend these key locations because they know they have synths there. The remaining 10 troops plus 4 agents would go with Desdemona and Deacon to try and get to mass fusion. The railroad's 60 synths would be split between Bunker Hill, Goodneighbor and the church, each base holding 20 synths. Now the Minutemen, I feel, would take a more defensible approach. The Minutemen would man their cannons at Castle Base, getting ready to unload on the BOS's airship if they need to. They would leave most of their troops in Castle Base, ready to hold the grounds. I think the Minutemen would leave around 270 men in Castle Base to defend their headquarters. 100 men would be sent out with Preston as their leader going into Boston. 50 of them would stop at the Great Green Jewel of the Commonwealth, Diamond City, and defend there. They would do this obviously to try and protect as many Commonwealth and Boston people as they could. The other 50 would go to the nearest settlement in Boston, or rather Hangman's Alley, as this geographically is technically the closest place to the mass fusion building where all the action is going to be kicking off. 50 Minutemen would be left here to rebuild up and get ready to defend Hangman's Alley if they need to. They would also start to use this as a staging ground for medics and supplies that may need to come in during the battle. The Institute would wait at mass fusion, bracing for a Brotherhood attack. Upon seeing vertibirds heading their way, they would quickly dispose of them using synths with rocket launchers from the mass fusion building. However, the vertibirds would still be persistent, even dropping Brotherhood knights and men on the ground to fight the synths in urban-to-urban street combat. The Institute would do their best to stop the vertibirds from being able to dismount troops onto the ground. They would know that Brotherhood versus synths in a one-on-one combat situation wouldn't wouldn't go in their favour, so would need to try and neutralise as many as the vertibird squads as they could. In this initial first attack, the BOS would take little amounts of ground and land and suffer heavy consequences due to them charging in riskily. 15 Brotherhood vertibirds would be sent out, and only 5 of them would actually be able to deploy troops successfully on the ground. None yet would successfully deploy troops on the mass fusion building itself. In the Boston area, this would leave the BOS completely disorganised, fighting in urban street combat outnumbered. The rest of the BOS forces would be marching from the Cambridge police station, and then further the most powerful group of the Brotherhood would be marching from the Boston airport itself, supported of course and marching with Liberty Prime. In this initial first attack, the Institute would sustain little to no casualties and would remain comfortably in control of the mass fusion building. The BOS by this time, on the other hand, would have lost already around 50 men, which includes 10 of their vertibirds. This is because of their bold and somewhat idiotic charge in without much thought. The railroad would be thrown instantly into battle and action, as their base would be completely under attack from the Institute's surprise attack. The 20 synths would be making quite easy work of many of the railroad's soldiers. Of course, leading this surprise attack would be the coursers, charging through their base, eliminating anyone or any railroad member who gets in their way. This would be an extremely messy and bloody battle for the railroad, as they were completely caught by surprise by the Institute. Key agents in the railroad would fall, such as Dr. Carrington, who would be holding the church from the Institute, and many other agents for that matter would be completely wiped out or killed. The railroad would try to hold the little tunnels of their base and would have some success against the Gen 1 and Gen 2 synths, but eventually the railroad would just be pushed back into their actual base, where Glory would be holding the front line. By this time, many of the railroad's agents, such as the Runner Boy, would be killed, and key figures within the railroad would die. By this time in the battle, half of the railroad's soldiers that were left to defend the base would also be wiped out, leaving their numbers at 15 soldiers left and 7 agents. This isn't saying that the Institute wouldn't sustain casualties as well, however, because they would lose all of their Gen 1 synths and half of their Gen 2s in this first initial fight. Meanwhile, across Boston, the other members of the railroad, such as the 10 men in Bunker Hill and the 10 men in Good Neighbor, would be setting up traps for their enemies. The 10 railroad soldiers with Desdemona and Deacon, plus the 4 extra railroad agents, would move into one of the Boston skyscrapers being held by the Institute, and they would try to desperately battle them to obtain the building as a vantage point. The Minutemen would prepare their cannons at Castle Base and would fire a load at the Brotherhood's Pridwin, destroying it and taking it out in an instant.
They had it coming. Should have never tried to lord it over the Commonwealth. That never ends well.
The ship would come crashing to the ground, most of the personnel inside dying a violent and deadly death. The Minutemen would further reinforce Hangman's Alley, as it was close to the mass fusion building, and they'd get ready for an attack from any forces. The Minutemen would come under surprise attack from coursers in Diamond City, one such being Mayor McDonough and many others. This would transform Diamond City into a chaotic mess of gunfire and bodies. The Minutemen would manage to hold on to the Great Green Jewel, but would lose around half their troops stationed at Diamond City, losing about 30 men. Now let's sum up what happened to each faction during Phase 1 of the Boston battle. The Institute would remain in control of the mass fusion building, but would lose around 30 synths out of their 405. They would lose all their coursers at Diamond City to the Minutemen, and any other synths in Diamond City for that matter that they had undercover. They would then lose half the synths sent to deal with the railroad. The Brotherhood of Steel would take the hardest hit, losing the most amount of men in this first initial battle, losing 50 men, which includes around 10 vertibirds. Furthermore, they would lose their home base, the Pridwin, to the Minutemen. They would lose the 120 troops who were stationed at the Pridwin, with very few being able to make it out of the fiery mess. Very key and main Brotherhood of Steel members such as the captain of the Pridwin and the science team would be completely wiped out among other important and significant members of the Brotherhood of Steel. This would bring the Brotherhood of Steel's number count down to 670, and we can also assume that they would have lost around 6 vertibirds from the Pridwin itself going down, which of course brings our vertibird count down from 35 all the way down now to 19. The railroad would suffer many casualties from the Institute's attack on their main base. They would also lose around 5 men from their attack on the Institute outpost in the Boston city. This of course means that their numbers would drop from 131 to only 111. They would lose key agents in the railroad such as Dr. Carrington and the drummer boy. For now, however, they would still keep all 60 of their synths. The Minutemen would start this fight very well. They would suffer their casualties only in Diamond City, losing half of their men to the synths and the coursers. This of course would bring their troops numbers down from 370 down to 345. Overall, I would say the Minutemen were the best in this initial engagement. They were able to take down the BOS and establish multiple chains of commands throughout the Commonwealth and bases. Minutemen would be followed up by the Institute and then of course the BOS, with the railroad of course in last place. The second phase of this battle in Boston would become far more bloody and large scale for the Institute as the BOS embed their troops on the ground and slowly start to gain land on the Institute, slowly getting closer and closer to the mass fusion building itself. The Institute would desperately try to hold the ground but would lose more and more synth units as the Brotherhood of Steel soldiers would just be too much for them. And for every Brotherhood knight you'd need about 2 Generation 2 synths to take them down. 9 vertibirds would attack the mass fusion building all at once, and then finally they would be able to deploy Brotherhood troops on the roof of the mass fusion building. Most of the Institute's units on the roof would have died by now, and their rocket launcher units would have ran out of ammo, thus making it easy for the Brotherhood to deploy troops onto the building itself. Both Proctor Ingram and Paladin Dance would also land on the mass fusion building itself. Them and their 40 Brotherhood of Steel units would make quick work of the remaining synths trying to hold mass fusion's roof. During this attack, they would only lose 5 Brotherhood of Steel soldiers from a vertibird attack, which means they'd also lose 1 vertibird as well. The Institute, on the other hand, would lose around 50 synth units from losing the roof itself. This brings the Institute's unit count of synths to 325. This, of course, however, is only counting the synth units they would have lost on the roof of mass fusion, because they lost quite a few on the ground as well, so we're going to add an additional 50 units lost to the ground of the Brotherhood. This leaves the Institute just about holding on to the mass fusion building, but now only having 275 synth units left. Brotherhood of Steel, of course, would continue their attack on the Institute, losing 5 men and 1 vertibird, plus 10 men on the ground, bringing their numbers down to 655 units left. BOS, of course, would be furious that they lost the Pridwin. Elder Maxim would rise from the ashes and gather his troops and his 9 vertibirds left and fly them straight to Castle Base to try and take down the Minutemen in an act of pure revenge. While meanwhile, of course, the other 9 vertibirds head over to the mass fusion building. BOS's ground forces in Boston would need to set up some sort of staging position and fast, as they were completely displaced and very erratically placed around Boston. Would decide to try and take the nearest outpost closest to the mass fusion building, that outpost and that place being Goodneighbor, of course. Brotherhood of Steel would send 3 squads of soldiers into Goodneighbor to try and take over the place. However, they would meet surprise backlash from the railroad, who would put up an incredible fight because of their 10 soldiers, booby traps and 20 synths that the railroad are defending in Goodneighbor. But of course, see Goodneighbor being turned into a mess of gunfire and chaos. 3 Brotherhood of Steel squadrons being pinned down in Goodneighbor by the railroad forces. However, they would slowly, inch by inch, make their way forward and through Goodneighbor, facing heavy resistance from the railroad. BOS would make contact with the Minutemen and fire on the Minutemen at once, using their 9 vertibirds. Brotherhood of Steel would manage to take a good few of the Minutemen's soldiers out. However, the Minutemen's castle Castle Base's defenses would just be far too much for the BOS, and they would nearly instantly lose 3 vertibirds, bringing their troop count down to 640, leaving this section of the Brotherhood of Steel with only 30 BOS soldiers to try and take the Minutemen and take down Castle Base. BOS would manage to take down a few of the Minutemen's cannons and even land in Castle Base, taking a small part of the base for themselves. The reality for Elder Maxim would soon set in, and so would it for the rest of his squad, with just how outnumbered they were in this battle. The Railroad would continue to fight a violent and deadly battle at their home base. At the end of this brutal and hard fight, they would only have 5 soldiers left and 10 synths, as well as only having 3 agents left, but they would have succeeded at defending the Railroad HQ. They had dealt with all the attacking synths, they would move out of the Railroad HQ, as there's nothing really here left for them. Take their 18 troops and head for Goodneighbor, where they could help the fellow Railroad troops who were pinned down by the Brotherhood. A small force would be led by Glory, accompanied by Tinker Tom and Pam. While in Goodneighbor, the Railroad would fight a hard battle with the BOS. 18 Railroad enforcements would eventually show up and support the other Railroad members in pushing back and enclosing on the Brotherhood forces in Goodneighbor, while Desdemona and Deacon would continue to fight a hard battle with their troops to try and take the vantage position in Boston. And the Railroad would be left with only 84 men, with 30 of them being left in Goodneighbor, desperately trying to fight the BOS. Minutemen would continue to fight the Brotherhood of Steel at Castle Base, slowly but gradually take more and more members of the Brotherhood out. Key members of the Minutemen, such as Ronnie, would be taken out by Elder Maxon wielding his laser minigun. The Brotherhood of Steel would put up a great fight, taking down 70 Minutemen, but would all be killed by the defending Minutemen not too long after arriving at Castle Base. The defending Minutemen at Castle Base with 180 men left. All 30 of the attacking Brotherhood of Steel members would be killed at Castle Base. Would hear about the chaos going down in Goodneighbor and would push through Boston to try and get to the place so they could help the civilians stuck in between the two factions' gunfire. And the Minutemen would actually arrive from Hangman's Alley, though the 50 men would come to realize that it wasn't just the Brotherhood and Railroad fighting, but now the Institute had gotten involved as well, trying to take the two factions out whilst they're busy fighting each other. Now let's sum Phase 2 of the Boston battle up. The Institute would lose ground in Boston around the mass fusion building to the Brotherhood of Steel. The Institute would lose all of their synth forces on the attack of the Railroad base at the Old Church by the defending Railroad forces. The Institute would also lose the roof of the mass fusion building, but would still just barely be holding on to the building overall. The Institute would begin to engage the Railroad, the Minutemen, and the Brotherhood at Goodneighbor. In the end, all of this would result in the Institute just having 255 synth units left. The Brotherhood of Steel would launch their second assault on the Institute defending the mass fusion building. In this second assault, they would have great success, only losing 5 men and 1 vertibird. The 45 Brotherhood of Steel soldiers who went to take down the Minutemen would be killed and eliminated by the defending Minutemen at Castle Base. 1 squad of Brotherhood of Steel soldiers would die fighting in Goodneighbor with the Railroad forces occupying the town. The Brotherhood of Steel would also lose around 15 men fighting on the ground city of Boston against the Institute. It's important I also say that Elder Maxim would be taken out by the Minutemen during that assault as well, leaving the Brotherhood uncoordinated. This would bring the Brotherhood of Steel's number count down to 605. The Railroad, of course, would win their fight against the Institute at the Old Church in their home base. At Goodneighbor, the Railroad would engage the Brotherhood of Steel, and then later the Minutemen and Institute. The small squad of Railroad soldiers would continue to fight alongside Deacon and Desdemona, suffering little casualties whilst trying to take the vantage position over the Institute near mass fusion. In the end, the Railroad would be left with 88 men/units left. The Minutemen would successfully hold their base at Castle Base.
Well, no fucking shit!
Against their oncoming attackers, the Brotherhood of Steel. They would also engage the Brotherhood of Steel, Institute, and Railroad at Goodneighbor, in which they would lose a few civilian casualties in the gunfire. In the end, the Minutemen would be left with 270 men. The Minutemen would be left with 750 civilians after this as well. Out of everyone in the second phase of this attack, the Institute would fare the worst, then followed up by the BOS losing their leader, and then followed up by the Railroad. Once again, in final place would be the Minutemen, comfortably and securely holding on to their position in first place in this battle so far. The Institute would slowly be pushed back from the BOS on both sides, from the ground and from the top of the mass fusion building. The Brotherhood of Steel would slowly push the Institute further and further back, backing them up against the mass fusion building slowly. The Institute would use everything they have to try and push the Brotherhood of Steel back on the ground front. They would use and deploy all the Gen 3 synths they had to try and hold the Brotherhood back and push them back from getting close to the mass fusion building. They would have some success at holding the Brotherhood of Steel back. However, this success would be greatly short-lived, as the Brotherhood of Steel's Liberty Prime would show up. Liberty Prime would decimate everything in his path. They would obliterate the Institute's synths until there was a straight, clear road for the Brotherhood of Steel to march to the mass fusion building safely. Once the Brotherhood of Steel would enter the mass fusion building, there would be little the Institute could do to stop their advances. The Institute would now be completely trapped in the middle of the building, having Brotherhood soldiers attack from the ground floor and from the top floor of the mass fusion building. The Brotherhood of Steel would close them off from the elevator and from the ground, slowly pushing the Institute back and then crunching on each one of their forces. Then Kellogg would give an important order to a group of Gen 3 synths to stay with him, and they would fight till the end. They would go down strong, taking out Proctor Ingram with them, while the remaining last 50 synths holding the mass fusion building would relay back to the safety of the Institute to retreat and hold their home base. Kellogg and the other remaining defending Gen 3 synths would be killed moments later in this battle. Meanwhile, this was all happening, and good neighbor the Railroad, Institute, Brotherhood of Steel and Minutemen would continue to fight, with the Institute taking down a lot of Brotherhood soldiers within the little community. But they themselves would be wiped out quite quickly after taking down the Brotherhood of Steel soldiers by the Railroad and Minutemen forces within good neighbor. By the end of all this, the Institute would be left with only 100 synth units left. Only having 10 Gen 3 courses left, they would also only have 20 Gen 2s, and the rest would be Gen 1 synths. They would manage to take down 100 Brotherhood of Steel soldiers, but they would lose almost everything. The Brotherhood of Steel would rally all their remaining men together at the mass fusion building exit. They would have all in all 505 men left. This of course is a huge number of men still. Their next order of business would be to march with Liberty Prime to the Minutemen's base, that base being of course Castle Base. On the way to Castle Base, the Brotherhood of Steel would stop off at Good Neighbor, as they would be well informed about the small group of Railroad forces that are in Good Neighbor, and they would know about the large group of Minutemen in the place as well. By the time the Brotherhood of Steel would actually enter Good Neighbor, the Minutemen and the Railroad would be in complete all-out war with each other, the Railroad and the Minutemen both suffering heavy casualties from this skirmish. In the end, both the Minutemen and the Railroad would both be completely overrun by the Brotherhood of Steel forces. They would manage to kill 56 Brotherhood of Steel soldiers, however they would all end up perishing to the great force of the Brotherhood of Steel not long after. This would lead to key members of the Railroad forces dying in Good Neighbor, such as Railroad member Glory, Pam and Tinker Tom. The Minutemen's second in command, Preston Garvey, would also fall. After this short stop, the Brotherhood of Steel would continue their march to Castle Base, home of the Minutemen. They would by this time have 449 men left, as well as 9 vertibirds. After losing all the men they had in Good Neighbor to the Minutemen and the Brotherhood of Steel forces, the Railroad would be left with only 53 Railroad soldiers / units left. Desdemona and Deacon's task force would only just barely win their mission and win their battle against the Institute for the building they wanted, only having 5 soldiers left after winning it. This of course is not including Desdemona and Deacon themselves. This brings the Railroad troop count down to only having 48 soldiers left. After beating the Institute out of this building, the small squad of Railroad soldiers would wait quietly and patiently for the Brotherhood of Steel forces to pass, then slowly making their way back to Bunker Hill to join with the rest of their forces. Once joined with their forces, they would then come up with a plan to push on the Brotherhood of Steel from behind with the remaining 48 troops they have left. The Minutemen would return all forces back to Castle Base and get ready for an imminent Brotherhood attack. They would station 10 Minutemen at Hangman's Alley and have them fire non-stop cannon bombardments at the Brotherhood of Steel, marching towards the Minutemen's castle base through, of course, Boston, where Hangman's Alley is. The cannon's hellfire would take down 20 BOS men and damage Liberty Prime, but the BOS would wipe out these 10 Minutemen with just a few Brotherhood of Steel soldiers. This brings the Minutemen troop count down to 200 men left, with all the remaining men and surviving men of the Boston battle so far within the Minutemen being told to defend Castle Base at all costs. The Institute would lose everything in this third phase of their battle. They would lose nearly all their synths, only having 100 men left overall out of the entirety of the original Institute left in the entire battle. The remaining 100 units left would all retreat out of Boston back to their base. They would of course lose the mass fusion building, lose Good Neighbor, and they would lose their battle to the railroad. They would also lose key members of the Institute such as Kellogg, who was their main man on the ground. In this third phase of the attack, the Brotherhood of Steel would gain uncopious amounts of land, of course gaining the mass fusion building over the Institute and taking Good Neighbor from the railroad and the Minutemen. They would end up still being left with quite a large group of men left, having 429 men. After the third phase of the battle, they would of course also still have 9 vertibirds, comfortably meaning they can still have air superiority over everyone else in the battle. They would sadly, however, lose Proctor Ingram, as she would be killed by Kellogg in the mass fusion building. The railroad would lose their long struggle of a fight at Good Neighbor, losing key members of the railroad such as Glory and other members. Desdemona's small special task force detachment from the railroad would of course win their battle against the Institute's synths in a building they were trying to take as a vantage position. In the end, however, the railroad would end up with just 48 men left after phase 3 of the Battle of Boston, but they would keep their leader and their second in command, more than a lot of factions can say, on this battle. The Minutemen in the end would end up just having 200 soldiers left, with an overall unit count now being 650 men in total. All the remaining Minutemen forces would end up withdrawing from Boston and going back to hold their main base, Castle Base. The Minutemen would of course also end up losing Hangman's Alley and Good Neighbor. The Minutemen would lose their second in command, Preston Garvey, as well. I think overall, once again, the Minutemen came out best on top here for phase 3, followed up by of course the Brotherhood of Steel, then the Railroad, and now for the first time, the Institute being last. Congrats Railroad, you weren't last in something. This is it all comes down to this, the final showdown, well, kind of. The Brotherhood of Steel versus the Minutemen at Castle Base. The battle would start with the 200 Minutemen at Castle Base getting ready and preparing for the imminent battle. All the Minutemen would man their stations, and the first sight of the Brotherhood of Steel's invasion on the Minutemen's base would be from the air. 9 vertibirds would come straight away to attack and take down the Minutemen. However, just like the last vertibird attack, the Minutemen would eliminate the vertibirds using their strong defenses. The Brotherhood of Steel would be able to deploy little amounts of men, and therefore they would lose heavily on this first front. The Brotherhood of Steel would lose 45 men, but so would the Minutemen, bringing their number count down to 150 men, and the Brotherhood of Steel's number count down to 404 men. Minutemen would see the large extent of the Brotherhood of Steel's army marching their way, with Liberty Prime with them, coming to the front of Castle Base. The Minutemen would shoot their flares in the hopes that they could get some sorts of reinforcements, but for now, they would just have to hold out. The general of the Minutemen would know there would only be one chance to take down Liberty Prime, and that would be to fire all their remaining cannons all at once at Liberty Prime, and try to directly hit them. Minutemen would do this, firing their 3 remaining cannons all at Liberty Prime and even hitting soldiers around him. However, not before Liberty Prime would get a laser shot off at the Minutemen's castle base, completely destroying and decimating half of the base and even destroying one more of the Minutemen's cannons. After this shot, however, Prime would fall. Prime, however, would take with him 50 Minutemen that he shot using his laser. However, the Minutemen's cannon shots would take down a lot of the Brotherhood of Steel's men, taking down 50 of their soldiers around Prime. This would bring the Brotherhood of Steel's number count down to 354 soldiers/units. Though the Brotherhood of Steel would sustain heavy amounts of casualties, they would continue to push forwards from 2 sides of the Commonwealth on the Minutemen's castle base. This would split the remaining 100 Minutemen into 2 sides, one side protecting the forward coming Brotherhood of Steel and the other side trying to protect the back half of the base. The backside of the base could easily be held off using the Minutemen's cannons and their good defenses, however the front side was decimated by Liberty Prime, so they would quickly begin to get overrun by Brotherhood forces. Suddenly, a large explosion sound could be heard from the back of the Brotherhood of Steel lines. The railroad would be seen ripping through the back of the Brotherhood of Steel's lines. This would catch the Brotherhood of Steel completely off by guard, and they would instantly lose 25 soldiers to this surprise railroad attack. This would bring the Brotherhood of Steel's troop count down to 334. This would not matter, however, as a large group of Brotherhood soldiers, around 100 men, would turn to fight the railroad and would begin to quickly decimate the railroad's forces and units. This would happen while the main group of Brotherhood soldiers would continue to pressure the Minutemen and push on them more and more with more forces and more troops. The Minutemen would get completely overwhelmed and push back into Castle Base. Inside, they would end up having just 50 men left, and they would have to retreat to the basement of Castle Base to try and hold out down there. In the end, it would look like they would be overrun by the Brotherhood of Steel's sheer power and numbers. But just then, at that moment, the Minutemen's reinforcements would show up. 600 Commonwealth folk prepared to fight for the Minutemen, to take back Castle Base and help the Minutemen. Using the Minutemen's large numbers now, they would enclose on the Brotherhood of Steel forces, entrapping them in Castle Base. The civilians would quickly overwhelm the Brotherhood of Steel forces, even though they were outgunned and outtrained. The Brotherhood of Steel would begin to take on heavy casualties, losing many men. The Brotherhood of Steel would manage to take down the rest of the railroad forces, killing all of them and wiping out the railroad. But by this time, the Brotherhood of Steel would have already lost 30 men to the railroad, bringing their troop count down to just 304 men, rapidly losing more and more men as the battle goes on. In total, this would bring the Brotherhood of Steel to only 304 soldiers/units left, and around 550 Minutemen left. The Brotherhood of Steel would put up a tough fight, but eventually every single one of their 300 men would fall to the Minutemen's sheer amount of numbers. This would leave the Minutemen with only 30 actual fighting men left, and having 250 men left who were in the civilian rank of the Minutemen. The battle for Castle Base had been very bloody for the Minutemen, but it would not be over for them yet, for the Battle of Boston would be far from over. The Minutemen would still need to take out the Institute. The only 2 factions left would be the Minutemen with 250 men and the Institute with 100 men left. This end battle would play out much like the ending of Fallout 4 if you pick the Minutemen option, with the Minutemen launching an attack on the Institute's base. The fight, of course, would be hard, considering that most of the Minutemen's forces would just be made up of civilians fighting. However, in the end, the Minutemen would wipe out the Institute and win the battle. The Minutemen would end up finishing with 150 men left. They would have won the battle, but at the cost of nearly everything. And in the end, they would only have 10 Minutemen soldiers left. Well, there we have it, the end of a series. Through this series, I've went through and ranked and looked at and overviewed every single mainline faction from Fallout 4, and what a journey it has been. I genuinely just want to thank you guys so much, especially if you're only here and you only watch my videos for that original Fallout content. If you are one of those people, I especially want to thank you because I know Fallout is something I don't upload as often as I used to, so thank you so much for all your support. It truly means a lot to me. I hope this is a satisfying end to the series, and yeah, I guess I'll just be ending it here. Well, that's not quite true, I suppose, as I haven't really talked about the factions from Far Harbor, or the Nuka World Raiders, or even the Gunners for that matter, or Super Mutants. In fact, what's to stop me from carrying on this series into Fallout New Vegas, or Fallout 3, or any of the other Fallouts for that matter? And maybe, just maybe, there's another popular Bethesda game series I could do similar videos on, just like this one. But you'll have to find out in the next Bethesda themed video. Thank you guys ever so much for your patience and support. I hope you're all having a good time and staying safe, guys. God bless you all, and thank you guys ever so much for watching. Peace out.